Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week, we dive into the stories, technologies, and ideas shaping a profitable and sustainable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today's guest has spent his life to genetics in the livestock business. Nate Zwald, who comes off of a dairy farm in Wisconsin, has had several executive roles at major AI semen companies throughout the globe, as well as serving in important roles in industry initiatives dedicated to genetics. He's a passionate advocate for phenotypical data in the dairy industry, where he started out his career in the university studying phenotypical data for dairy genetics. In today's conversation, we're going to dive really deep into the world of dairy genetics and why things have changed so rapidly with genetic progress in the U.S., and also some of the potential structural issues and structural things that are changing and could change in the near future and what that looks like for the industry. So being somebody that loves data, I really enjoyed this interview, and I hope you do too. So listen up to our conversation with Nate Zwald. So on today's episode, we're talking about something that I'm really passionate about, and that is the genetic world of the dairy industry. Now, there's a lot that's happened over a long period of time to bring about the U.S. dairy genetic advancement that we've seen over the last 50, 60 years. And we're going to talk a lot about how that came to be today. And we're also going to talk about some of the different things that we're looking at that are coming up in this world that could shake it up. Today's guest is somebody that knows this world better than most people anywhere, and I'm really excited to have Nate on the podcast. So thanks, Nate, for being here today. Good to have you.
Absolutely. No, data has been something that is fundamental to really many industries, and all the changes that we're experiencing currently with companies working together, but also just in the AI, future that's really going to make a fundamental difference on where the industry's been and how the industry works together going forward. So it's an exciting topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about it, Paul.
Yeah, and I give your bio in the intro, but I want you to go through a little bit more of your history in depth, what those roles actually entailed, what you were doing, and what you got to see as the genetic progress in the industry happened, and then a little bit of history as well around that genetic advancement and why.
Sure. My whole life's really been in dairy genetics, and I started at a very young age, growing up in the barn, milking cows with Dad and my uncle, and actually got to see genetics firsthand. We had a really good cow back then, and actually I was about 8 years old, and she was going to set the all-time record for the most milk at the farm. And so I got woken up out of bed, and the DHIA tester was there, and I got to run outside to see how much milk she gave that morning to see if she would do it, right? And I kept watching the meter fill up, and she did it. And she happened to be, I think she was the top cow in Wisconsin that year. It was 1983. And I said, man, we just need more cows like this. You know, you're thinking as an 8-year-old, and I actually got my genetic interest from that experience because my dad said, don't worry, we've got a daughter of that cow, and she's out of the best bull in the world. And so we know she's going to be better. Now, we didn't know she was going to be better, but she was better. And that was kind of my first really recognition of how genetics worked. If you take the best and you breed it to the best, you get better. And that's how we move that curve to the right and forward. And that all is based on data. But that experience back when I was 8 years old was really fundamental to, my interest in genetics with the dairy farm. And I've always been very linked and and really responsible for the dairy genetics program at the farm. But then as I went off to school, I was also very interested in kind of the traditional dairy showing, dairy, judging. I went to college actually to be in dairy judging and phenotypic evaluation of cows. Got kind of recruited to Madison and wanted to win the contest, right? And so that was all about type. And really spent my undergraduate degree or time focused on that phenotypic evaluation of dairy judging. Knew it wasn't the only thing that was out there, but that was kind of my focus. And then I got to grad school and I started to realize how important the performance of the cow was and that we weren't predicting that accurately by looking at the cow. Maybe that was because I didn't win the national contest and I had to go a different direction because I didn't win it, but did pretty good at the same time. And really then in my grad school projects, I started working on genetic evaluation and the importance of data. So in grad school, I did a genetic evaluation, another way to put data, international data together to create a different evaluation versus doing it on a country by country basis. So that was the first kind of project that really encompassed how important data was to genetic evaluations, the access of it, where it comes from, the quality of it, and the quantity of it as well. And then I did another project, which was trying to get data directly from dairy farms to do evaluation for new novel traits, a lot of the early metabolic health traits that are now routinely evaluated by CDCB and Zoetis. And that was my project 23 years ago, I guess, to get that data directly from herd management programs like Dairy Comp or PC Dart, now Bovasync, collect that data and see what was there. And some of that work actually led to other new novel traits like sire conception rates or SCR, and also daughter pregnancy rate or the daughter fertility traits, because that was such a key, that the sire of the cow being bred was such a key component to if she got pregnant or not. So that those projects in grad school really allowed me to see the importance of data and get excited about, further excited about the opportunities we had with genetics. And the crazy thing about that is, as I sit here in the industry today, it's hard for me to even believe that you could think about genetics pre-genomics, pre-sex semen, pre-beef semen in dairy cows. But here I did, 5 years in grad school. Glad it was done after 5 years and I got into the industry and did some real work and some really exciting things after that. But, it's hard to believe that 20 some years ago, we didn't have genomics, we didn't have sex semen, we didn't have beef on dairy. It was just trying to make better cows faster. So then I got into the industry. I really spent a few years in product development and trying to create great genetic evaluations with really, really high quality data when I was at Alta Genetics, and trying to care a lot more about the data that was feeding into the genetic system. So we were trying to say, well, we'll take all the data from everywhere and we don't know if it's good quality data or crappy data. And we tried to change that model to say, we want to know where the data comes from. We want to know the quality of the data. We want to verify the quality of the data by a parentage test. And then we want to use accurate data to make our genetic predictions. And that was really successful and was really on the cusp of having a huge impact. And then genomics came around. And you kind of had to take that choice of, do you dig your heels in the sand and say, well, we're going to continue with what we've always done? Or do you accept that this new technology comes around and kind of, blows things up and blows you out of the water? Well, we accepted the new technology. Certainly glad that we did. I kind of went out on a limb at that time and said, hey, genomics isn't going to be perfect, but the science is ultimately going to win. And the genomic predictions are going to be accurate, even if they're not today. And it turns out they were pretty accurate from the beginning. But of course, they just continued to get more and more accurate. And now they're completely accepted. Again, it's hard to look back sometimes and realize that for 3 to 5 years, people didn't know if they could accept or trust genomic predictions on the sires they were using. And now it's just pretty much internationally recognized that, there's no such thing as well as a genomic bull or daughter proven bull. But that was a big question mark for a number of years. So during that time, I guess I always appreciated the opportunity to show commercial dairies around the world the impact of genetics. And of course, that all started with quality data and the predictions that were associated with it. And so part of that data was actually validating that genetics worked in their dairy farms. And that was a pretty fun exercise to be able to show a commercial dairy that, didn't have this perception that genetics was driving the performance in their dairy farm, to take their own data, split it into groups and say, well, here's how your best genetic animals perform versus your worst genetic animals. And you can see the impact in your dairy. Because a lot of times at that point in the industry, people would say, wow, I don't even know where these numbers come from. But when you did that and you took a dairy farm's information and showed them, this is how your best perform versus your worst, it really put a lot of lights on in people's minds. And that really then, as you fast forward to where we are today, you see that's all just kind of taken for granted, but none of it exists if we don't have that core of the data flow in the industry, the accuracy of the data, and then the genetic predictions that come from that data.
So what you're saying is that the importance of that data really hasn't changed. The phenotypical data really hasn't changed even with the advent of genomics. It's just actually helped make things better.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's that genomic predictions don't exist, or, well, I shouldn't say they don't exist. They're not accurate without phenotypic data predictions, or phenotypic data flow and continuous flow behind that. That is taken for granted in the industry, and that is changing. About 10 years ago, I moved from Alta to ABS and was running the international business. And while at times I felt like during that you get a little bit further away from the direct conversations with the dairy farms, that was what we did. And what we tried to do is make a difference for the dairies always, and for our customers, and put the customers at the top. And so part of that was the right genetics for the right dairies. But it does feel, and a reality is, as genetics is just more appreciated as working and being part of the reason dairies make progress, and the performance that we've seen, especially in Holsteins with the component levels of fat and protein, a huge part of that is genetics. And that's now appreciated because we've gone on this trajectory because of genomics and sex semen and beef semen. We're really making about 3 times the amount of progress today as we did 10 years ago, or 12, 15 years ago, and probably 4 or 5 times the amount of progress that we did before genomics was here. So it's kind of a tremendous story of how fast we're going and how that curve has accelerated. And when you think about that, when it goes faster, it's easier to see and realize. And so today, customers recognize that impact that they would have made over 3 generations in a single generation. So, some of the non-believers now say, I can see that my first lactation cows are performing better, they're more fertile, they're lasting longer than even the last generation. And that was part of the issue with genetic progress and the appreciation for genetics previously, is it was hard to see and make tangible. But today, I think it's easier because that curve is going so much faster. And then a big part of that, and it would totally be remiss to not mention this, but a huge part of the reason we're making so much genetic progress today is because of sex semen. So genomics with sex semen has been huge, and it's not because of sex semen on the male side. It's actually because of sex semen on the female side. So traditionally, and I would have said this if you found a podcast from 25 years ago, which I don't know if podcasts existed, but all the progress in the industry was made because of what we did as an AI industry, what bulls we brought in, who we sold those genetics to, because there was really no selection on the female side. But the biggest reason that curve has really taken a new slope is because sex semen gets used, and it doesn't get used randomly. It gets used on the best animals in the herd. And so if you only allow your best females to have offspring, the genetic progress curve for the industry, and especially in an individual herd, is tremendous. Now, how we decide what those best females are always comes back to data. And so we still have to come back to that quality of data, quality of prediction, because if we have the wrong information predicting that she's the best, or we use the wrong traits to say that she's the best, then we're, propagating the genetics of the wrong cow or the wrong animal. And and everybody can have different goals, but if we want the goal to be purely production, but we're selecting the best phenotypic animal for those traditional type traits that we learned about in dairy judging, we're going to have the wrong answer. And so it's how you put the data together, and then the accuracy of the prediction. So, we can make a genomic prediction about anything, but how accurate is that to predict the actual performance or the actual breeding value of those animals? And that all comes back to data. And sometimes I definitely feel that the importance of that data and the quality of that data, it's taken for granted in the industry right now because it's been the fundamental building blocks. But when you compare where the dairy industry is on that data compared to other industries, we shouldn't take it for granted in the dairy industry because it doesn't exist in near the same quantity or quality in industries like the beef industry that I get to work on today in my current roles, like it does in the dairy industry. And we don't want to slip back to that spot in the dairy industry either.
Well, that brings up a great point. Historically, DHIA has been a really strong route to get a lot of this data from. So there's a couple of points on that I wanted to maybe go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. So DHIA, when I started milking my cows at my dairy, I was on DHIA test once a month, once every 6 weeks. We'd test. So I got one sample, one milking out of 4 to 6 weeks worth of milking. That was the only thing that I had. So that was a lot better data than what I had. But what's your thought around having that one data point that is taken by accurate instruments versus now today I have Lely robots. I got milk and protein from that. And I also have daily milk recording for each milking on that. So it's not on a ICAR approved apparatus, but I do have more data that gives me a much deeper picture into what's going on with that cow. So I guess let's start on that point on the terms of data quality. What are your thoughts around that?
So that's definitely a bit of a rabbit hole, but I like talking about it because what you're really diving into is like standard data that we get and have always gotten, which is DHIA. And it's been a tremendous example of the power of standardization of data over 75 years. But we're in this era now, and we have been for a while, about, well, what other data is available, and does that actually flow through DHIA? But then the other really important point that you mentioned is, what is the purpose of DHIA today when you have all of that data at your fingertips with a robot dairy or a parlor system that collects all that data? It doesn't have to be whatever it is. There's actually way more data available on the farm today from a management perspective than what DHI used to be able to provide. And the importance of that data from a management standpoint is that you can compare your cows within your herd comparatively. So even if it's not an ICAR approved, fat and protein percentage, you know which ones are performing the best in your dairy, and you know it every day with repeatable data. And you also know when that cow got milked last, and you know how much feed she ate, and you know what pen she's in, and you know how she's performing compared to what you expect her to perform, but also compared to all of her other contemporaries on a daily basis, or really even on a milking basis. So that's a huge difference compared to the one time a month standardization that DHIA always provided. And I was lucky enough to be involved in the CDCB board and some other industry initiatives over the years. And this has always been an issue. And really going back to that grad school study that I talked about, like if your cow gets ketosis and you mark that down in your herd management program, that didn't flow through the DHIA system. Now there's ways to get it to flow today, but it doesn't all flow. And then the question is, well, what do you mark down as a ketosis cow? Do you mark her down if you drench her because it's almost a preventative drench? Or do you only mark it down if she's like on the cusp of having a DA, right? And sometimes those health events don't even get marked down. So it's impossible to do a genetic evaluation if you don't have consistency of that data recording. And I know from my own experience as well, if one herd manager is really, really good with the computer and wants to write everything down or put everything in the computer, great. But then maybe the responsibilities change or that person changes and the next person wants to write it down on a piece of paper because that's how their mind processes things. If it doesn't get into the computer, there's zero chance of it kind of continuing to flow on and be useful for the industry purposes. Doesn't mean it's not useful for the herd management purposes, though. And then kind of that's an example of the next part is, what is the importance for a dairy to be on something like DHI when you have all of that information daily or hourly or every minute on all the information that DHI can provide? So that's at your fingertips. It's already, inside of the dairy. You don't need an outside entity like DHI to come in, measure what you already have, and feed the same information back to you. So with that reality, the question is, what's the continued utility of DHI? And if that means that DHI is going to slowly reduce itself in value, which I believe it has because it still focuses on collecting those standard data points, how do we continue to have genetic evaluations? And I think that's a real fundamental question. The percentage of cows that are on DHI in the US today has slipped just under 40%, and traditionally it was always over 50%. Now, personally, I'm actually surprised it hasn't declined further because of exactly what you said, Paul. You've got all this information already there at the dairy. Why pay another dollar per cow per month to have somebody come in and verify the data that you already have? But we need that, and we need that data flow to create genetic evaluations at the national level and really to have the power of that data. And again, to make the analogy, other species aren't in the same spot that the dairy industry is. Beef, for example, the data that gets passed on in the beef industry is kind of user controlled, user recorded weaning weights, yearling weights, and there's a lot of that data that exists in a beef operation that's written down on a piece of paper, kept in an Excel spreadsheet. But if there's no reason to pass it on, if nobody's paying for that data, what's the point of passing it on? Now, if you've got a bull or you want to contribute to genetic evaluations, that's the reason to pass it on. But I still believe today, one of the big reasons that DHI is still testing about 40% of the national cow herd is because of legacy things. And that means that people in the industry still believe it's important for the good of the industry. But how does that change as we roll through generations here? Some of the biggest dairies in the country still DHI test, but they have all the information that they need at their fingertips. But the reason they do it is to get genetic evaluations on their cows, which is still an important thing. But you can do that in another way. You can genomic test them all and get a good prediction. They do it for kind of the continuation of the industry as it is. And maybe dads are still involved and they want a DHI test and they want to continue to make the industry a better place. But I see that changing very, very quickly as we roll through a generation, and people saying the same thing that you did is, well, why do I need this extra cost when I have all of the information at my fingertips? And the way I like to explain that is people might say, yeah, from a macro point of view, we like the genetic evaluations, but from a micro point of view, meaning what's important for my dairy, I kind of have the same information today and tomorrow, whether I take on that extra cost or not. And that's kind of a problem because there's a gap, because I'm sure you don't want the genetic evaluations to go away, but you say, well, I can't justify that extra cost every month when I have all the data at my fingertips. I've kind of already paid for that data by installing the robots and getting the data that comes with that. So now we've got this issue where, yeah, everybody wants the good of the industry, but first and foremost, you want profitability at your farm level, and that sometimes isn't in sync with the overall industry. So somebody's got to pay for that data. And if it's not valuable for you as a dairy farmer to pay to get DHI data as an individual manager of day-to-day basis, then you're going to stop. And then the data stops flowing, and then we have kind of an issue on our hands.
Yeah, I talked about this a couple episodes ago. I had thought about the value of farm data and trying to put together a framework around it, and I kind of built it up into 4 different levels of value. Level 1 is what you're talking about, that I now have all of that value through all of the instruments that I've purchased to collect that data on my farm on a daily basis. That's what DHIA used to be able to provide. They don't anymore. What I call level 4 value is industry scale value, aggregated value across the industry. And that's what you're saying. That's really the only reason DHIA still exists today, even though we have all this other, it's not really providing much level 1 value because we can manage our farms with the data that we have on our farms today. So I think that begs the question of, what do you see happening? What do you see as potential forks in the road coming up here? If we still need this valuable data, what's happening? What are some of the other players doing in the industry? What are some options that we have moving forward that could potentially play out in the near future?
Yeah. And I think you said it well with the level 1 data, the level 4 data. One of the other things that's happened as an industry, another source of data, has been that what comes along with genomic testing. And so when you genomic test your females, there is not only the genomic data that comes with that, meaning the actual SNPs, the actual genes that those cows inherited or have, but there's also the phenotypic data that's associated with that. And the combination of those two is how we come up with the genetic predictions, right? You have to have both the genetic information and the data. Incidentally, that's actually why genomic predictions work so great in the dairy industry, because you have both buckets of data. In humans, for example, we can genomic test you and you can get a little bit of insight on, some of your specific genes that have a big effect on certain things like heart disease or other things. But if we had the data associated with every human that's lived like we do in dairy cows, it would be scary what we could predict about human performance, right? And I truly mean performance. We could be predicting how fast I can run or lack of how fast I can run. We can predict how tall your kids are going to get. You can predict how long people are going to live, right? With a pretty good range, because that's what we do in cows. The reason we can't do that in humans is because we don't have this phenotypic data associated with everybody in a computer that says how long they lived, what diseases they had, what their health history was. But we're getting scarily close to that with all the stuff the health insurance companies have. If I was a health insurance company, I'd want to, buddy up to the genomic testing companies that are doing these genetic tests, and you can start to build an incredibly valuable database. I don't know what that means for Earth. Interestingly, driving through Texas the other day, I drove through the town of Earth. It's a population of 901. My kids got a kick out of that, but you can see a future where the future of the population of Earth is really driven by some of these things. And I don't want to get into the moral things about that, but the same is happening in the dairy industry. And the power of this combination of the genotypic information in one bucket is only powerful if you also have those phenotypes. Now, one way to get those phenotypes is through DHIA, but another way to get those phenotypes, and potentially even more powerful and more comprehensive phenotypes, is by getting access to the herd management system and information on every farm, whether that's a dairy comp backup or a bovasync backup, or you use the Lele management program or whatever it is. Everybody has something that is keeping their herd management, their herd in a digitized way. And so one of the things about genomic testing is most of the time, at least in the Zoetis world, the main genomic tester is when they ask you to genomic test with them, they want access to your phenotypic information as well. So not just the phenotypic information that comes through DHIA, but all of the phenotypic information you have at the dairy level. And 99.9% of the time, people say, yeah, no problem. Sure, that's perfect. Of course, you need that anyway to associate the samples with who the sample is, what the birth date is, what the sire is, what the mother is. But then what comes along with it is all these other phenotypic traits. And that's hugely valuable for an organization trying to create these genetic evaluations like Zoetis. And you see Zoetis recently here, they just acquired Neogen for $160 million to have an additional outlet to basically roll up the testing game into, what was Neogen or Zoetis. And there's a few other companies that do it as well. But that's a huge chunk of the market share now that is going to be Zoetis when that merger all goes through, where they're testing the animals and then they have access to this phenotype. And that phenotype is pretty
about
valuable.
85 to 90% of the market, right?
It could be that. It could be as high as that. There's still the genetic companies, the AI companies, and AI, I have to say not artificial intelligence, but artificial insemination companies that are still doing some testing. But as far as the testing that's not done through an AI company, meaning it was part of the deal you signed up for, it's certainly a very, very high percentage, probably at least 85% that will be Zoetis now. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a big multinational, privately held pharmaceutical company that you could see a path, and I'm not saying they're going to do this, but you could see a path where that data comes back as something that is used collectively to make their business interests better instead of being exclusively valuable for the dairy farmer.
Right, which is one of the points that probably DHIA served long term, was kind of that buffer data protection layer for the farmers because it was a farmer-owned organization, correct?
Yes, and they always had a mantra that it's farmer data, and we're not going to, it's not going to be a for-profit data thing. And it's a little bit like us when we type in a destination. If I'm going to come to your farm, I type it into Google and it takes me there. And I don't care that Google knows exactly how I drove to your farm and exactly where I stopped for gas or food or whatever. But because it doesn't mean anything as an individual, right? We don't care. But collectively, Google cares a lot. How often do you stop, right?
It's
What
very
route do
valuable.
you take? Where did you stop? All of these things. And it starts to become like there's a business interest in that data when you can collectively say, this is what the average human does. And that's a little bit the situation that we're in with dairy if we don't look out, where, the individual micro data is like, yeah, that's no problem. I'll share it with everybody. But collectively, that data is getting more and more powerful. And of my interests in genetics, it's essential that it continues to kind of flow for the benefit of the industry and not just for the benefit of, private interests or certain organizational interests.
Yeah, one or two companies.
Yeah, and going back to the other species, one of the reasons that genetics is such a powerful thing in dairy is because of that data flow that's continued, right? And so I get to work in the beef genetics today. And the reality is there's still genomic predictions in the beef industry, but people don't trust them in the same way, not because they're not done accurately. It's all because they're not as accurate because they don't have as much data flow backing up those predictions. So if you say one bull is 2,000 pounds of milk prediction in as genomics in the dairy industry and another is 500, you're like 99.9% sure that bull A is a better bull than bull B for milk production, right? So that's only one trait. In the beef world, if you say, well, bull A is, got a yearling weight of 150 and bull B has a yearling weight of 100, you don't have that same level of assurance that that's the way it's going to work out. And the reason for that is because there's less data associated with it. So what's the implication of that? There's less people that trust the numbers because you're not sure the numbers are precise enough to drive your decisions. And so that's the importance of that data and that accuracy. It's not just about making a prediction. The prediction part is easy. It's about the accuracy of that prediction that drives decisions that is fundamental. And so in the dairy industry, if we stop having that data flow because everybody decides not to participate in industry level things like DHIA, and they're just happy getting a genomic test and doing what's important for their dairy on a day-to-day basis, all of a sudden, we start to lose precision of those estimates, or we can't come up with new evaluations for new important traits, or we're letting others dictate what we should do instead of making those decisions on our own.
Yep. And with a lot of the data that we're collecting on farms today, as you had mentioned, it's probably more comprehensive than what DHIA was already taking. So we have feed data, we have weather data, we've got all this other data that we're taking in. We can see heat stress in the systems that we have on our farm. Utilizing that data, as you just mentioned there, would give us potentially more traits that we can target if we can accurately pull that data through the system and have that mechanism for it.
It's another great rabbit hole. I love the idea that we can select for animals that are more feed efficient. It's fundamentally a fantastic concept. The problem is we get ahead of ourselves when we don't have the data to do it, and we start making estimates for feed efficiency that aren't precise enough or accurate enough to drive a real difference. And that's problematic because that's where it's, and there's a lot of this in the industry actually, and it's easy to see that as I step out of the AI industry a little bit, and everybody tries to come up with their new trait or their new evaluation or their new list of robot ready cows or something like that, or robot ready sires, because it's like, it's an easy sale, right? It's like, we want to say that this is the right thing for somebody. But what's the data behind that that's really projecting or predicting that? And feed efficiency is a great example. Is there a genetic difference in feed efficiency between animals? Absolutely. There certainly is. But measuring it with the right data and then making the right decisions off of that data is a totally other question. Because once we know there's a difference and that it's important to dairy farms, and we know it's important to dairy farms and beef farms and everybody in between, Now today, when corn is relatively cheap, 3 weeks ago we would have said, or 4 weeks ago we would have said really cheap, but when corn's cheap and beef is super high, the feed efficiency actually isn't talked about nearly as much as it would be if beef prices are where they are and corn was $8. Then we'd be saying, hey, which animals are the most feed efficiency? Because it wouldn't just be, shovel them some more corn. But in the long term, something like feed efficiency, dairy farms, beef farms is absolutely essential. How much of that feed gets turned into meat or milk? And actually, it's really important not only for that conversion into animal proteins, but there's really good science now saying that if that feed isn't converted into a protein, it actually escapes through methane, right? And so that's not good for the environment. So feed efficiency isn't only important for the profitability of the farm, but it's also important for the environment. And it's really nice when things work out like this, because now we're not at odds with like the, environmental people. It's like, hey, we all want feed conversion. We might want it for different reasons, but that's great. But what's the incentive when everybody starts talking about feed conversion and the importance of it? Is to say, oh, look at this bull. He's great for feed conversion. I should sell that to you, Paul, or to whoever. And we've got to be careful to make sure that data is accurately recorded and we're actually measuring what we want animals to be, which I'm concerned about feed efficiency in all the different ways it's calculated. I think there's, the really accurate way, which is we get every animal that feeds into the genetic industry for feed efficiency into individual weigh boxes where they stick their head through. It measures which cow they are, and it measures exactly how much they eat every time they go eat. But that's pretty unrealistic to do on a commercial level. Now, there are some things that have done great research at showing camera vision data that is aligned with that weigh box idea and says, hey, we're measuring how the feed pile changes, and that's pretty intriguing. And I'm very excited about that, actually. But there's a lot of feed efficiency evaluations that are in the industry today, both for beef and dairy, that are based on estimating the cow weights. And you have Lele robots. You know exactly how much every cow that goes through your robot weighs every single time she gets milked. That's an actual weight. Predicting how much she weighs by what the classifier scored her as on a linear of how tall she was, how strong she was, and how wide her rump is, that's not a very precise estimate. And it's one time in her life, right, as a milking cow. So we really need that data that says, hey, how much did she weigh? How much did she eat? How much did she milk? How much of that feed went into animal protein? And then we can get really good genetic evaluations. But DHIA doesn't collect that data because that's not part of the standard, things that they collect. So there's a great example of more data being available at the farm level, and collectively that data could be hugely valuable. If you have cow weights, individual cow intakes, and individual daily production, whether that's growth in beef or whether it's milk production in dairy cows, that's feed efficiency data right there. But when it doesn't get transmitted through to a collective in the industry, then you can't use it because your data sits in your computer. My data sits in my computer. Some people don't have any of it. And that's the problem. We know it's valuable. We know people will use it if there's a genetic evaluation. So then people create genetic evaluations that don't have the data behind them. And that's not great for the industry because then people start making decisions that aren't as accurate as they would like them to be. And then they don't see the impact. And then they start to not trust what's there.
Yep. Well, this is a great example of the concept that I wrote about in my Nuffield paper. Many people have listened to the podcast for a while, heard of it, the whole data cooperative concept, somewhat what DHIA was doing as we discussed earlier, but really for the digital age to be able to take in a lot more data points and be able to connect with a lot more systems to get way more phenotypical data than what has been done in the past.
Yeah, it's a really good paper. It's a great concept. And, I think that actually a good example is all the data that exists on robot dairies. Now, robots aren't maybe the predominant way to milk cows yet in the U.S., but in some other countries, it's getting close. And there's a lot more data associated with a robot system, starting with those cow weights, which I think are fundamental. And I'm really glad that that's starting to get recorded, even if we haven't quite yet figured out how to put the data together and make it a good thing for the industry. And the risk of not putting it together in something like you've outlined of a cooperative effort of farms getting together is that somebody uses it for their corporate interests. And nothing against corporate interests. That can still be good for the industry. But I think that one of the reasons we've gotten so much out of genetics in the dairy industry is because DHI existed, and that was not a corporate interest, but it was an interest in the industry. The problem with it is it's just kind of fell behind the times because, in the 1900s, it was hugely valuable for dairy farms. I remember growing up and you look at that test sheet and you see how much each cow milked and how much fat and protein she had and what her cell count was. But when that's at your fingertips every day, you don't need that monthly piece of information. And then when you get into the new traits, like, how cow weights and how much of their feed are they converting to weight gain versus milk versus components, and what that feed efficiency is, that's the data that really is important, but it's hard to see how the collective of data in the industry structure today is going to have the impact that it could have.
Right. I really appreciate you bringing that up and discussing that. One other point that I want to hit on, maybe it's another rabbit trail, but the other AI, artificial intelligence, I talk a lot about it on the podcast here. Where do you see that changing things in the genetic business in the dairy industry?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's a really great thing. First, it's really important to say this is all opinions, right? Because none of us know, and AI, we should probably ask AI that question because it probably knows way better than we do. It's kind of amazing what that tool's been, and I talk to people every day, up until maybe a year and a half ago, it was something that I didn't use a lot, and then you start to ingrain it in your daily life, and I'm still surprised how many people, the impact that it has from somebody that didn't touch it 3 months ago and is now using it every day. And maybe it took me a little longer. I've been playing around with it for a couple of years, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, but the impact of how you utilize it is really shaping what we do and how we do it. And, a lot of people are scared of it, and perhaps rightfully so. And this is kind of a same micro, macro kind of a view. Like macro, am I scared of what it could do? In some ways, yes. But from a micro perspective, I'm not going to not use it because of that risk, because, you just fall behind everybody else. Because when we look at what we do on a daily basis, you're not as good without AI as you are with AI as a tool that you can use, right? And the analogy of a consulting is like, AI is not going to replace consultants, but consultants without AI are going to be replaced with consultants with AI, right? And I think we can use that same analogy with genetics. And frankly, we've been focused on all the traditional traits, and rightfully so. And then we continue to add new traits. I think the question is, how does AI fundamentally change that equation of we need the data to flow into a computer, then you do a genetic evaluation, and that spits out genetic predictions, and then everybody uses them. And one of the things that AI is really good at and can be incredibly important at is predictive models. And so it's not only genetics that predicts a cow's performance, right? Genetics does a great job as a group. If you got a group of animals that are, have a PTA of 2,000 pounds of milk and another group that has a PTA of 500 pounds of milk, I can assure you that if they perform in the same farm, the group that's 2,000 pounds of milk of 100 cows or whatever is going to outperform the one that's 500. But that doesn't mean that there's not some of the animals in the group that is 500 that are going to outperform some of the animals that were in the group that is 2,000. So those curves overlap when it comes to phenotypic performance. That can be because she had an easy calving and another one had a hard calving, or, one that was predicted to be great genetically, got bred 4 times as a heifer and got really fat and didn't have a, good calving. All of these things are somewhat genetically related, but there's also a big environmental component to those things. And one of the realities that AI can do, and there's some companies working on this, is predict that performance, not only with the genetic insight, but adding all of the individual phenotypic measurements of that animal along the way. And that's pretty exciting to me. So now you start with their genetic prediction, and that is their breeding value. And I want to reinforce that's still their breeding value. But what things have happened to that animal along the way that are going to affect her performance? So for example, if you have the best genetic animal in your herd born today and you're super excited that this is a great calf, the best calf you've ever had, and you go out and look at her and, she's got scours and she's coughing and standing in the pen in the back, and she's a lunger, I guarantee, and she's not going to be your best cow. But that doesn't mean her genetics have changed. That simply means that she's had some unfortunate environmental effects along the way that are going to make her not perform as good as some of her herd mates, even though her genetics predicted that she would. So now with AI and with prediction tools, you can say, well, genetically she was here, but we know she's actually predicted to perform here. And that's really, really important. And there's been tools along the way in the industry that have looked at that and tried to predict that. But I think now with the power of AI, you can do that in a much more comprehensive way. And you can get kind of what I'll call a predicted producing ability, which is a real term of an animal that includes the genetic prediction plus the phenotypic prediction to say, hey, this is what we expect her to actually perform as, which is different than genetics. There's some really innovative companies that are out there that are working on these things, like Phoenix is one example, but I'm certain that the big organizations like Zoetis have ideas about how to incorporate AI into their genetic predictions, especially as they encompass this Neogen testing platform. But the data is still going to be important. And that's where when you start to say, well, this is really exciting, it also becomes risky when you think about the impact that large organizations can take and what they're going to know that you might not know because you only have your individual data. So I get both excited and some days, 1 out of 10 days at least, a little bit scared of what that could be. But 9 days out of 10, I get very enthusiastic about the impact of AI and kind of into that precision management of a dairy farm. Even the OVSync protocols and such, it's pretty amazing what the industry has been able to do in terms of our reproductive rates by standardizing some of those protocols and the system for a dairy and saying, hey, every cow gets enrolled at a certain days in milk. But is that the right thing for every single cow? Probably not, right? And we know it's probably not because some cows are great performers, some cows aren't super performers. We need to get some bred back much earlier than others bred back. And as we know how fertile we predict that cow to be, we can really dial that in. And that's maybe the exciting part of this, is that we can really start to dial it in on an individual level that allows us to get that little bit of extra performance above and beyond what we get as a herd level, which of course drives the herd level. So yeah, I think AI is really, really fundamental to that. And I think AI can dive into the other part I should mention about AI is it's going to have the ability to further transform genetic predictions, because we've known for a long time, really since the beginning of genomic testing, that things like whole genome sequencing is going to be more informative than the traditional SNP-based test of genomic testing. And we've had genomic testing for over 15 years now. We're still fundamentally using the same technology where we extract DNA from the animal and we put it on a SNP chip, figure out what SNPs they got on the important parts of the genome, which are the important parts of the genome, but there's all the rest of this genome that we don't pay attention to because we feel it's not as important as what the SNP chip identifies. And that's true, but that doesn't mean doesn't have any importance. And what whole genome sequencing does is continues to mine that rest of that genome to find areas that are important and can continue to evolve to be important in today's animals. And so I'm excited about that combination of whole genome sequencing with AI to find the areas of the genome that may not be informative today, but will be informative should we focus on them as well. And that's something that the genomic predictions have always been, they're retrospective. So they say, this is the data that we have, this is what it shows, and therefore this is what we predict. With AI, we can predict changes in some of those other regions of the genome that would show what can be if we change them. And that's something that is a little more proactive instead of retrospective with genomic evaluations.
Right. So with that technology, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of exciting things that we can do and progress in, which is great. But I really appreciate you also bringing in the importance of looking at things as an industry to make sure that we're doing this in the right way. We have the right structure for managing this data and making sure that it's being used for the benefit of the industry.
Right. And that's essential, right? And I'll go back to my beef analogy again. There's lots and lots of data that is important for the beef ranchers out there, or feedlot, or even packing plants, where we know what that animal's weaning weight was, but do we know how that associated with the carcass? And largely, we don't, because the individual carcass data doesn't feed back into the system. I'd love for it to do that. So short of it doing that at an industry level, what ends up happening? Well, certain companies try to create that loop for the benefit of themselves to, push their genetics forward instead of for the benefit of the industry. And I'm not saying that the benefit of that organization or any organization isn't also beneficial for the industry, but everybody tries to do their own thing. And so even on a smaller scale, we try to say, hey, we have some insight that is above and beyond what we can get from the industry level genomic testing data. And that's true because we have individual carcass data and individual growth data. But if everybody passed it along, the industry would undoubtedly be further ahead than if everybody keeps this bucket of data here and this bucket of data here and this bucket of data here. That's what we kind of risk in the dairy industry now as well. It is kind of getting the data, it just split up instead of all collective for the dairy industry. I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of, but yeah.
A lot more fragmented.
There you go. I was thinking fractional, but it's fragmented. Yes, a lot more fragmented sets of data and data in different buckets, and those buckets don't talk to each other. So that's certainly less valuable. Each bucket can be valuable itself, but you want those to collectively be the best insight you can be instead of, well, we know that this is the best, but we don't let everybody else know because we want to use that insight first and foremost for our own interests.
Right. So, Nate, I really appreciate you. We're running up here on time, but I really appreciate you being on the episode today, sharing your wealth of knowledge and your perspective on where the industry is going and the importance of data. I always love talking about, of course. So thank you so much for what you've done in the industry, what you're doing in the industry, and for being on the show today.
All right. Well, thanks for the invitation. I like talking about it as well. It's crazy what's happened with data in the last 25 years. It's going to be even crazier what happens with it in the next 25 years. But if we work together, we can harness the power of that data and really put it to good use. And, when you think about what the industry's done in the last 25 years, the opportunity in the next 25 years can be both exciting and frightening at the same time. But let's make it exciting.
Right. Thanks so much, Nate.
Take care.
Well, that's a wrap for today's episode with Nate Zwald. I hope you enjoyed his ideas, his thoughts, and his wealth of knowledge that he has on the genetics business in the dairy industry. If you're interested in finding out some more about the concepts that we discussed and you want to check out the Nuffield paper that I wrote, you can go to my website, paulwindemuller.com. It's located there. If you're interested in connecting with Nate, he is also on LinkedIn. And with that, I just want to say thank you to our friends of the show for providing this episode commercial-free for you guys and supporting the work that we're continuing to do here at AgCulture Podcast. You can check them out in our newsletter or our website at agculturepodcast.com as well. So with that, thank you for listening, and we will see you next week for another exciting episode of the AgCulture Podcast.